The halls of Caligula's palace never echoed with political debate or philosophical discussion. Instead, they rang with the desperate pleas of people begging for mercy. Under his reign, Rome's most powerful families discovered a new category of terror, one they could never have imagined. Fathers were forced to auction away the dignity of their own daughters. Husbands had to stand and applaud while their wives suffered public humiliation, as if watching some twisted theatrical performance designed specifically to break their spirits. This wasn't the random chaos of a madman acting on impulse. It was deliberate, carefully calculated, and methodically executed. A complete system where brutality wasn't an occasional exception to the rule. It was the daily routine, the normal way of conducting imperial business. Every horrific act was meticulously documented in official government records, listed like any mundane expense of running the empire. Each atrocity had a specific price tag, a reference number in the ledgers, and an established procedure that had to be followed. Through this twisted machinery of organized depravity, the mightiest empire the ancient world had ever known bent its collective knee and bowed before a system of institutionalized horror. To understand how Rome fell this far, how it descended into such darkness, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to return to that moment when a smiling, charming young man was hailed and celebrated as Rome's great hope for the future. But before we continue deeper into this dark journey through history's shadows, please take a moment to help Echoes of History grow. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss our explorations of the darker corners of human history. Your support means everything to this channel. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, nicknamed Caligula because of the miniature soldier boots he wore as a small child, was the beloved and cherished son of a legendary Roman general. When he ascended to power, people welcomed him like a miracle, like a gift sent directly from the gods themselves. The celebration lasted for a full 100 days across the empire. To the cheering crowds filling the streets, he represented the glorious continuation of a legendary dynasty. Senators finally relaxed and breathed easier after enduring years of suffocating paranoia under Emperor Tiberius. Nobody, not a single person, could imagine that this well-educated, charismatic, charming young man would become the mastermind behind the most organized and systematic corruption of morals that Rome would ever witness. Caligula's early years were a strange mixture of enormous privilege and deep psychological trauma. He was raised among hardened soldiers, men who revered and worshipped his father as a military hero. But he also witnessed the much darker side of imperial politics up close. His father Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances, almost certainly through poisoning orchestrated by political enemies. Then came the complete destruction of his entire family structure. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was exiled to a remote island. His older brothers were either executed outright or locked away in prison cells to slowly waste away. Young Caligula survived this purge only by carefully playing a specific role, appearing harmless, acting foolish, and seeming completely non-threatening to those in power. Living for years in Emperor Tiberius's palace taught him one crucial lesson about how Roman power truly worked. Survival didn't depend on strength or honor or military skill. It depended entirely on deception, on the ability to wear masks and hide your true intentions. He became an absolute master at pretending, at showing the world exactly what it wanted to see, while concealing everything beneath the surface. When he first took the throne at age 24, everything seemed genuinely wonderful and promising. He dramatically reduced taxes on ordinary citizens. He freed political prisoners who had been rotting in cells for years. He organized spectacular public games that left crowds breathless with excitement. He improved infrastructure throughout the city, building impressive aqueducts and repairing major roads that had fallen into disrepair. Rome absolutely adored him. Women scattered flower petals in his path as he walked through the streets. Children made up songs, praising his name and wisdom. Senators, who would later tremble at the sound of his approaching footsteps, competed desperately for just a few moments of his attention and favor. It genuinely felt like Rome's long-awaited golden age had finally arrived after so many dark years trapped under Tiberius's fear-driven rule. Then the autumn of 37 CE brought complete disaster. A mysterious illness struck him down with terrifying force. He spent weeks hovering on the very edge of death. Court physicians documented fevers so intense and burning that they thought no human body could possibly survive them. He suffered violent convulsions so powerful that it required multiple strong men to physically restrain him and hold him still. In his delirious episodes, he claimed to be speaking directly with Jupiter himself, receiving divine messages and instructions. All of Rome was paralyzed with fear and uncertainty. Priests made endless sacrifices to the gods, slaughtering animals day and night. Some desperate citizens even publicly vowed their own lives if it meant the gods would spare and save the emperor. When he finally opened his eyes and returned from the brink of death, something fundamental and essential had broken inside him. Something had changed at the deepest level of his being. The first warning sign was almost subtle at first. He commanded that every statue of every god throughout Rome should have its head carefully removed and replaced with his own likeness. After that initial act, the transformation became impossible to ignore or dismiss. His eyes, which had once been lively, warm and engaging, turned hollow and predatory, with pupils that seemed unnaturally wide and dark. He developed severe and relentless insomnia, wandering the palace corridors throughout the long nights, whispering to marble statues, holding conversations with the moon itself, and responding to enemies that no one else could see. Servants regularly found him at dawn, completely naked in the palace gardens, covered head to toe in soil and dirt, claiming with absolute conviction that he had been planting Rome's destiny in the earth. The transformation began not with strangers or political enemies, but within his own household, with his three sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger. They were no longer simply family members bound by blood and tradition. They became the first victims of what would gradually expand and evolve into official state policy. His fixation on Drusilla, the sister he seemed to favor most, was particularly extreme and disturbing. He called her his Diana, his divine companion. He treated her publicly as if she were his empress, seating her prominently in places at ceremonies and public events that were reserved strictly and exclusively for imperial wives. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 CE, Caligula spiraled immediately into a frantic, uncontrollable rage that shocked even his closest advisors. He ordered an official mourning period so strict and severe that laughter, bathing, and even sharing family meals were completely forbidden throughout Rome. Anyone who dared to display even the smallest sign of happiness or joy was immediately executed without trial. But this overwhelming reaction wasn't genuine grief born of love and affection. It was the pure fury of someone who felt his personal property had been stolen from him by death itself. With Drusilla gone and buried, his intense attention and focus shifted immediately to his two remaining sisters, and then expanded outward to encompass the daughters and wives of Rome's entire elite class. This is precisely where the true system, the real machinery of horror, finally emerged and took concrete shape. Caligula began forcing noble women to participate in degrading acts with senators and other powerful men, while he personally watched from a specially crafted golden throne, sitting elevated above everyone else. He took careful, detailed notes on who seemed eager and willing, who hesitated or showed reluctance, and who simply tried desperately to remain polite and neutral. These meticulously kept notes later became powerful political weapons and leverage. A senator who showed obvious enthusiasm when paired with Julia Livilla suddenly began supporting every single imperial order without the slightest question or resistance. Another senator who showed clear reluctance found his young son missing one morning, and when the boy was returned several days later, he had been permanently harmed, castrated as a brutal and unmistakable warning to his father. The message being sent was absolutely clear and impossible to misunderstand. In Caligula's new Rome, neutrality simply didn't exist as an option. Everyone was forced to become either a perpetrator or a victim, and most discovered they would be both at different times. A Roman physician named Lucius Scriba left behind writings that remained hidden for centuries in a villa near Pompeii. These documents described in clinical detail how Caligula personally forced him to examine noble women and young girls, carefully assessing their fertility and their physical ability to endure repeated use. These examinations were deliberately humiliating, performed directly in front of the emperor himself, who asked increasingly invasive and degrading questions about each woman's body. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty driven by momentary passion or anger. It was organized, bureaucratic, and executed with the same precision and attention to detail as conducting a government census. Prices and fees were carefully standardized across the entire system. 16,000 sesterces for a night to spend time with the senator's wife, 2,000 sesterces for access to a virgin daughter, 5,000 sesterces if someone wanted both mother and daughter together at the same time. The payments didn't disappear into private pockets or secret accounts. They flowed directly and officially into the imperial treasury, cleverly disguised and recorded as voluntary contributions made for the good of the state and empire. The palace itself became what Caligula insisted on calling, quite literally, a temple of divine service. And he meant this absolutely literally, not as mere metaphor or poetic language. This was no symbolic rebranding of existing spaces. He systematically refitted entire rooms, redesigned corridors, and restructured rituals to function exactly like sacred religious machinery. Each chamber within this complex was given a specific name and served a particular function in the overall system. There was the Room of Jupiter, a large space specifically used for the emperor's ritualized abuses, where he cast himself in the role of a living god, bestowing his divine favors on mortals. There was the Chamber of Venus, carefully staged and decorated for enforced ceremonies that compelled noble matrons to participate in recreations of mythological scenes. There was even a specialized hall associated with Priapus, where specific acts of humiliation were systematically carried out against those individuals the emperor personally chose and selected. Caligula commissioned elaborate and expensive frescoes to decorate all these spaces with vivid imagery. The beautiful Travertine halls that had once hosted serious debates about military campaigns and legal reforms now echoed with very different sounds that haunted those who heard them. The system supporting all this was incredibly intricate and complex, far beyond what anyone imagined. First in the chain of the hierarchy came senators, wives, who were officially drafted into what the emperor formerly called the imperial cult. They followed strict schedules delivered to them in writing, wore designated uniforms made of sheer Syrian silk so fine it was virtually transparent and purely ceremonial in nature, and performed specific rituals according to rigid timetables that had to be followed precisely. Next in line came the daughters of these same families. Girls as young as 12 years old were gradually introduced and eased into the system under the carefully constructed pretense of receiving divine instruction and religious education. But Caligula didn't stop merely at humiliation and degradation. A collection of secret memoranda and documents describe what amounted to nothing less than a deliberate breeding program. Women who were judged most fertile based on physical examinations were compelled and forced to bear children who were destined from conception to be raised as imperial dependents. These children were separated immediately or soon after birth from their biological fathers and trained from earliest infancy to serve various court needs and functions. Every single conception, every birth, and every infant death was carefully noted and recorded in the official ledgers. Many of these forced pregnancies ended in desperate attempts by the women to prevent childbirth, a grim statistic that scribes dutifully recorded without emotion or comment. Men and boys were also not exempt from this system. Caligula specifically ordered the deliberate feminization of the sons of patrician houses, dressing them in diaphanous saffron-colored tunics, painting their young faces with white lead and vermilion pigment, and teaching them to move and gesture in ways he personally found pleasing and attractive. These boys were paraded prominently at elaborate banquets and then auctioned off for the night to the highest bidders. The emperor's personal involvement in these acts was rarely, if ever truly, about physical desire or pleasure. It was entirely about domination and the demonstration of absolute power. Each individual act, each public violation and humiliation was a completely deliberate political statement being broadcast to all of Rome. Nothing is sacred that I cannot defile. No tradition is safe from my touch, and no family is immune from total collapse. Perhaps the single most savage and psychologically destructive innovation in Caligula's entire system was precisely how he enlisted and recruited families to participate actively in their own complete destruction. Many parents were forced not merely to witness passively what happened to their loved ones, but to actively collude and collaborate. They were made to serve as torchbearers in official processions. They were required to add their signatures to legal contracts, formally consenting to the service of their own wives and daughters to the imperial cult. The Senate, that ancient and supposedly dignified body, was systematically pressed to pass specific laws that cloaked obvious abuse with a veneer of religious legitimacy and legal authority. One such carefully crafted statute formally declared the emperor's physical body to be sacred and divine, thereby framing any union with him, no matter how forced, as a legitimate form of religious worship. It was legal architecture deliberately built and designed to sanctify the emperor's violations. Senator Cornelius provides perhaps the clearest and most tragic example of how this mechanism of coerced complicity actually functioned. When he was officially summoned to hand over his wife Livia to the emperor, he actually stood up in the middle of the Senate and publicly refused. It was an act of public defiance, genuinely brave but ultimately fatal in its consequences. The very next morning, Cornelius's 8-year-old son was discovered on the Senate steps, mutilated but still alive, bearing an unmistakable message that had been literally carved into his small flesh. The warning worked exactly as intended. That same afternoon, a broken Cornelius personally delivered Livia to the emperor. Several months later, when she became pregnant, by imperial decree, Cornelius was forced to formally and legally recognize the child as his legitimate heir, publicly abandoning any inheritance claims from his other children born in his actual marriage. Running this massive apparatus required an administrative structure and bureaucracy that rivaled Rome's entire civil government in its scope and complexity. Hidden clerks working in sealed chambers kept meticulous registers in a secret archive located deep beneath the Palatine Hill. Each file carefully followed a standardized template that included the victim's full name, precise age, complete social rank, detailed physical description, specific acts performed, duration of each session, degree of apparent cooperation or resistance, any resulting pregnancies, exact fees paid, names of physicians who examined the women, detailed records of any injury or illness, names of midwives who were present at forced births, identification of guards who escorted victims on their set schedules, and accountants who carefully tallied all revenues flowing into the treasury. Hundreds upon hundreds of people became essential cogs in this grinding machine. There were official prosecutors of propriety who enforced standards. There were specialized caretakers responsible for ritual clothing and costumes. There were official midwives appointed specifically for this purpose. There were scribes whose sole job was writing and maintaining the endless lists. There were guards assigned to enforce the precise timings and schedules. And there were accountants who balanced the books and tracked every single transaction. The deliberate dispersion of responsibility across so many individuals made it psychologically easier for each person to avoid taking moral ownership of what was happening. Nobody had to stand alone as the singular monster. Everyone could claim, and many did, that they were merely fulfilling an assigned role, following orders, doing their small part in a system much larger than themselves. Certain nights were ritualized and formalized as public spectacles and performances. Full moon nights were considered prime time for these events. Caligula staged elaborate lunar fertility rites in a specially converted private amphitheater, transforming it architecturally into what resembled a staged pagan temple. He personally arranged matches with carefully selected participants, chosen for specific characteristics: gladiators who were famed for their physical vigor, Nubian captives who had been brought from the empire's distant frontiers, and even animals on certain occasions. These creatures included trained bears, Molossian mastiffs bred for size and strength, and once even a leopard that had been presented to the emperor as a royal diplomatic gift. Husbands and fathers sat in the elevated galleries dressed in their formal senatorial togas, forced to maintain perfect composure and dignified bearing, while their wives were systematically degraded on the floor below them. The emperor orchestrated every single detail like a masterful ringmaster controlling a circus, personally deciding the pairings, the numbers of participants, the duration of each act, and even specific body positioning, using a gilded baton topped with phallic symbols to physically indicate and signal his choices to participants. An entire shadow economy gradually grew up around the palace's constant needs and demands. Street vendors openly sold special ointments and eye washes that were claimed to ease physical pain and discomfort. Clandestine apothecaries working from hidden locations supplied dangerous substances for abortions. Private tutors offered discreet lessons, teaching young survivors how to convincingly mimic compliance and cooperation. Doctors opened new medical practices focused specifically on physical repair and reconstruction of damaged bodies. Everyone who touched this system in any capacity charged fees for their services. Everyone profited financially in some way. And that profit, that flow of money, is precisely what made the entire system so durable and resistant to change. greed effectively lubricated complicity and kept the machine running smoothly. The official histories written by court historians never recorded what the human bodies trapped inside the palace actually lived through and endured. But those bodies themselves told their own stories in ways that couldn't be erased. Scars formed patterns like a private alphabet of pain that only the victims could read. Bellies swelled with unwanted pregnancies that women tried desperately to hide beneath layered garments. Faces completely stopped smiling, the very muscles responsible for expressions of joy atrophying from years of disuse. There was a woman named Valeria, the young daughter of a prominent senator, who, after enduring months of ongoing abuse, fell entirely and completely silent. Doctors confirmed after examination that her vocal cords still functioned normally. She didn't physically lack the ability to speak. She had simply lost the language, lost any words adequate to describe what she had endured. Attempts to resist or escape were desperate and almost always ended fatally. Some women managed to steal poison from the palace gardens or obtained it from sympathetic sources, swallowing it quickly before they could be taken. Others deliberately disfigured themselves using knives or by burning their own faces with heated metal, hoping desperately to render themselves useless and unattractive to the system. But imperial physicians were highly skilled professionals, trained in the arts of restoring both life and physical appearance. Many suicide attempts were medically reversed, and the women were returned to the spectacle, often punished with additional extra public humiliation specifically designed to deter others from making similar attempts. The Imperial Archive continuously swelled with new entries, thousands upon thousands of individual records, each one more detailed and clinical than the last. Every single violation had its own specific code, a primary category, and multiple subcategories for precise classification. There were standardized forms that had to be properly filled out, established protocols that had to be meticulously followed, and rigid hierarchies that had to be obeyed. Caligula sometimes deliberately showcased the ledger itself as an instrument of terror and control. He would read selected passages aloud during Senate sessions, choosing names and entries at random, forcing fathers and husbands to sit and hear the cold, clinical descriptions of exactly what had been done to their wives and daughters. On the night of January 24th, 41 CE, a final brutal ceremony was staged, one that Caligula clearly intended as the absolute apex of his public pageants and displays of power. Wives of senators were pitted against gladiators in an auction-like competition. Numbers were called out like livestock prices. Bodies moved like automatons, fatigued into submission. It was the last spectacle. The very next day, as Caligula moved through an underground passage on his way toward the theatre, Praetorian officer Cassius Chaerea and a determined group of conspirators ambushed him in the darkness. They stabbed him repeatedly, delivering dozens of wounds to his body, including one deliberate strike directly to his genitals, a symbolic reversal of all the humiliations he had inflicted on others. The bitter irony was impossible to miss. The same men who had actively helped enable and administer the system were the exact ones who ended the life of the man at its center. Caligula's wife, Caesonia, was murdered shortly afterwards. His young daughter, Julia Drusilla, barely more than a small child herself, was also killed by the conspirators. They clearly intended to wipe out the entire dynasty, to completely erase his bloodline from existence. The new Emperor Claudius immediately declared damnatio memoriae, official condemnation of memory. Statues throughout the city were systematically toppled and broken. Inscriptions bearing his name were carefully chiseled away from monuments. Coins bearing Caligula's likeness were collected and melted down. Official memory was heavily censored and rewritten, but physical paper and living people still remembered. The children who had been born under the breeding program grew up never knowing their true origins. Victims aged carrying secrets permanently sealed inside them. Fathers who had once been forced to carry torches during those state ceremonies could never again look their own daughters directly in the eye. Caligula's death removed one man from power, but it did not and could not remove the system he had so carefully engineered and constructed. Institutions have long afterlives that extend far beyond their creators. The detailed manual for institutionalized cruelty, the comprehensive registers, the established procedures, the legal precedents that had been formally set. None of these things vanished simply because his corpse was dumped into an unmarked grave. They could be rewritten, reissued, and adapted for future use. In the end, the echo of that assassination night proved the most damning testament of all. Men applauded an act of murder with the exact same hands that had once held torches during the rituals. The empire moved forward outwardly, but inwardly the deep wounds remained. Caligula had not simply indulged in personal depravity and cruelty. He had written comprehensive instructions for turning systematic atrocity into legitimate governance. And instruction manuals, once they are written and distributed, are never truly gone.